large language models.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jayson Marwaha. I'm a general surgery resident at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And thanks for letting me share some of our early exploration into the use of natural language processing for post-market surveillance of FDA-approved drugs and devices. I do have one relevant disclosure to make, which is that some of the ideas I'll be sharing comes from a startup that I'm an advisor for, but Sages, of course, does not endorse any one specific product or vendor. So I'll preface some of our work by saying that the regulation of medical products, drugs and devices, but especially devices, is an ever-growing challenge. And I say devices in particular because, firstly, because of the growing massive number of devices that are approved in the US every year, but in particular, because of this unique pathway for device approval in the US called the 510K pathway, which many of you probably already heard of, but it's a pathway by which, in brief, new devices can be approved without rigorous preclinical studies if they are considered substantially equivalent to a already legally marketed device. Now, 99% of the devices approved on the market in the US right now are approved this way, and not an insignificant fraction of these approved devices are unfortunately either based on predicate devices that were recalled themselves, or are actually not substantially equivalent to the predicate device that they reference in their application, or they are based on predicate devices that have very little clinical data themselves when they were initially approved. And so this, as you can imagine, results in very large volumes of approved devices on the market that don't have very much clinical data on them that need to be surveilled. Now, of course, regulatory changes ultimately will likely be a very large part of the solution to prevent the wrong devices from making it to the market, which are which have been discussed by the FDA for many years now. But post-market surveillance is also a very large component of the FDA strategy to ensure safety. Oh, thank you. The FDA has an initiative called the Sentinel Initiative that enables some of this post-market surveillance, mainly by monitoring insurance claims data for emerging signs of issues with approved products. But as we know from doing research on insurance claims data ourselves, it's an imperfect tool and is not generally granular enough or reliable enough to be well suited for a task like this. So the FDA's Sentinel Initiative actually recently expanded their pool of data that they use to surveil products to include very large amounts of unstructured clinical data from electronic health record vendors as well. This opens up a very large opportunity in that there is now a massive amount of unstructured data that now can be used for surveillance. But the FDA, of course, alone doesn't have the bandwidth or the technical capacity to make effective use of all this data. And so in response to this opportunity, just last year, many researchers working at the FDA published a piece that recognized the potential of natural language processing tools like emerging large language models to be applied to these analyses. And they also mentioned in their piece that there's another opportunity that lies in all of this, which is that merging this clinical data with other sources of knowledge, including biomedical literature, and also public discourse, may be useful for signal detection of problematic drugs and devices. And so just over the last several months since that piece was published, this concept of applying natural language processing to unstructured clinical data to surface adverse events and serve, in some sense, as a signal for what drugs and devices need to be investigated is in the process of being validated, and it's just one of many studies doing so. But the question that we were interested in hoping to shed some light on is...
I'm having some trouble with connection. Please try again in a moment.
Try again in a moment, please. Just over the last, the question we were hoping to shed some light on is whether non-clinical public sources of data could provide any useful signal. Non-clinical sources of data meaning, for example, what patients are saying and what news sources are saying. And we also wanted to kind of find out if this is a data source worthy of being incorporated into these analyses as well, as the FDA sort of hypothesized it may be. And so we've only just begun to look into this, and we started by using drug recalls during the COVID-19 pandemic as an initial use case for some of these studies because of the plethora of online activity and online discourse around drugs that were coming onto the market at the time. And what we started to find is that there may potentially be some early signals that emerge from these data around products that ultimately are destined to have regulatory problems. So for example, we looked at a monoclonal antibody from Eli Lilly that was originally given an emergency use authorization early in the pandemic, but then was very quickly found out, mostly sort of anecdotally, to be infective against several variants of the disease. And so, using that as one of our use cases, we analyzed data purely from the public domain, from public data sources, and used an off-the-shelf text sentiment analysis model from Google to analyze this unstructured data. And what we found is that online discourse of this drug began in late 2021, and that this discourse and these sort of anecdotal reports were on average quite negative from the start. And I should mention that this is in contrast to some of the other non-recall drugs that also had some negative sentiment in the public discourse about them, but the magnitude of this negativity was generally not as great. And so the actions around this drug actually seems to lag behind this discourse timeline that we elucidated. So the federal government was still heavily investing in this drug in March 2022, despite several months of preceding discourse about it, negative discourse about it. And while they did take some steps to limit access to it much later in November 2022, they actually didn't revoke its authorization until December 13 of 2024, just actually a few months ago. And so, we hope to do a much more comprehensive validation of this concept on drugs and devices, in the near future, and much more study obviously needs to be done on this, but it is possible, we think, that public discourse around medical products could potentially be combined with clinical and academic data to identify products that are worthy of closer examination, or worthy of closer regulatory examination. Thank you.